Welcome everyone to the second episode of AP Prep Plus, and today we're going to be discussing units 2.4 and 2.5 of AP Macroeconomics, inflation and its costs, or rather costs of inflation, just to clear that up for you. Now, first off, let's begin by defining inflation, which is defined as the general rising of prices in a market or aggregate economy over time. So, of course, surges in aggregate demand, of course, result in higher prices. That's ceteris paribus when aggregate supply stays constant, and this increase in price is defined as inflation. Before we move ahead, let's define the different types of inflation. You have creeping inflation when the rate of inflation is less than 3% each year. When you have really good economic growth, especially in your supply chain, that's when you have creeping inflation because demand is able to go ahead whilst aggregate supply is increasing, and this results in sustainable growth of your economy, which means it's not going to be demand surges with a strangling supply chain. So inflation is less than 3% each year. This next type of inflation is walking inflation, which is the most common type. As of right now, inflation is at probably 8.6%, down from 9.1, but most of the times, even if it's unsustainable, it will be walking inflation like it is in the US right now. The next type is galloping inflation, when the rate of inflation is greater than 10% each year. The threat of galloping inflation is what made the Fed enact its monetary policy of interest rate hikes. So we don't reach a point where inflation is greater than 10% each year. I mean, imagine you're paying that much more money. It's not really worth it, to say the least. The last type of inflation is hyperinflation. This is often what happens in countries like Zimbabwe and Venezuela, where the rate of inflation has exceeded 50% year over year on a yearly basis. So if you do that compoundingly, that's I think 62.5% or whatever. That's definitely not what it is, but fair enough. My math is pretty bad, so forgive me. Now let's move on to the next part of this video, which is to talk about price indexes. Now, before we talk about how inflation is measured, it's important that we know on what basis can one measure inflation, because let's say I take the AP textbook and it cost me $10 in 2010, and the same textbook in 2022 costs me, let's say, $30. I can't make the assumption that we've had 300% inflation since 2010. That's just one microeconomic item. Now, let's discuss how this is actually measured. A price index is a measure of a basket of goods, commonly created by the government itself. In the US, the prevalent price index is the Consumer Price Index, and it's set by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The CPI is based on over 94,000 price quotes collected monthly from around 23,000 retail and service establishments, as well as 43,000 rental housing units. Now, what this essentially means is when you calculate a CPI, it takes into account the items that are needed by family the most for their daily lives. So that's gas, rent. Rent is very important because, it's essential. You need somewhere to stay, and food. So gas, rent, food, and whatever other minute items, like you might add sub-items in the food category, like wheat and rice. Now, once it finds the right balance, it'll create a basket and it assigns it a cost. By setting a base year CPI or price basket, we can then measure inflation. We'll find out why the word base year is more important, but let's move on now. Now, let's do a bit of math in calculating these price indexes. 2016 price index, you have price of milk is $3 a gallon, wheat is $2 a gallon, and gas is $5 a gallon. Now, as you can see, you multiply the price by the quantity to get the total value. Then you sum it up. So 3 into 10 is 30, 2 into 10 is 20, and 5 into 10 is 50. Therefore, keeping these three items of a basket in mind, the 2016 Consumer Price Index basket is worth $100. Now, in 2017, we see that for the same quantity, the price has increased, which means $325, $350, and $525 into 10 is $120. You might be noticing the fact that quantity remained the same, but the price went up. The answer is inflation. Now, the formula for calculating the rate of inflation is the inflation percentage in year N is that year's consumer price index minus the consumer price index of the base year divided by the consumer price index of the base year in 100 because you want it in percentage. So let's do that for 2017. 120 minus 100 divided by 100, that's 0.2 because 20 by 100 into 100, so that's 20%. Now, another bonus question for you guys is, which type of inflation occurred in 2017? I'm going to pause it for now. If you want to pause the video, you can do that. All right. The answer is galloping inflation because it exceeded 10% on a yearly basis. Good work if you got that correct. Now, this is something which people often get confused with, so just focus up a bit. I personally know I got very confused with menu costs of inflation and shoe leather costs when I was studying for the AP exam. I was lucky enough to figure it out, but pay attention for now. Now, much like everything else in life, inflation too has its costs. The first one being lower purchasing power, another one being many costs of inflation, third one being shoe leather costs of inflation, and the fourth one is wealth redistribution. Apart from the first one, the latter three can be quite confusing, especially at first sight. Don't worry, it's not that confusing. Just let's go with the flow. Now, moving on to the first one, which is a loss of purchasing power. Let's take into account the baskets we calculated a while ago. In 2016, the entire basket of goods would have cost me $100, but I would only be able to buy 5/6 of the basket the very next year because, 100 divided by 120, because it now costs 120 and I only have $100, so I wouldn't be able to buy the full basket and the entire quantity that I would have got the year before. This means that everything else remaining constant, you can buy a lesser quantity than before with the same amount of money, and hence the loss of purchasing power. The second cost of inflation is a menu cost. Now, the name, while at first glance can be quite confusing, it essentially means the change in any business-related materials that have prices on them, like a menu. Quite simply, it's in the name. Now, when Costco obviously realizes that their costs are increasing and they want to start raising their prices, they'll have to have their they might have to hire more workers because obviously they already have workers doing the rest of the stuff. They might have to hire more workers and spend more time in order to make sure that everyone has to go ahead and change all the price tags so no one is buying it at pre-price adjusted tags or pre-inflation prices, because that would be a loss for Costco. So the time and effort that goes into changing all those price tags on all their products is an example of a menu cost of inflation. Now, moving on to the third one, which is shoe leather costs of inflation. These are the costs of time and effort that people end up spending to counteract the effects of inflation on their finances. And it's not just businesses, but also individuals. Now, let's say I realize inflation is at 9% like it was this year, and I know that the cash I have on hand is depreciating every time. I mean, I live in Dubai, and the milk used to be $10 once upon a time, and now it's 14. That's AD, so don't worry, it's like $1 difference, but it's still a lot of money. So when I realize that, I say, let me open up a savings account. So I have to drive to the bank, and that is an explicit cost of inflation because I have to take my cash and deposit in the bank, which means I'm spending time and, of course, money on gas to go and do that. That is a very explicit shoe leather cost. The other one would be because now I have my money in stocks, bonds, mutual funds, hedge funds, ETFs. I have invested all of my money. I have very little cash on hand, so it's the implicit cost here would be the consequences from having most of your money in investments and very less on hand. So let's say I'm a business and I want to expand. I say, oh no, I have to liquidate some of my investments to do that. And I miss out on the opportunity of expansion because the cash wasn't with me at the time of the opportunity. So that's a summary of shoe leather cost of inflation. Now, the fourth one, this is by far my favorite type of cost. I mean, I love this one a lot, so let's get into it. Now, before I go ahead and explain wealth redistribution, it's imperative that we understand in most cases the nominal interest rate, which is what the bank will tell you. Let's say it's 3.25%. It's imperative that we understand this nominal interest rate is equal to the real interest rate plus the anticipated rate of inflation. So let's say the real interest rate is 2%, but the bank expects 3% inflation the next year. Your nominal interest rate would be, you guessed it, 5%. Lenders will be hurt by unanticipated inflation because the money they get will be paid back with less purchasing power. Borrowers, on the other hand, will benefit from unanticipated inflation because the money they pay back is worth less than the money they borrowed in real terms. If the rate of inflation is higher than anticipated, lenders will be losing more money and borrowers will be paying back less in terms of real value of money. I'll give you an example. Let's say I borrow $100 at an interest rate of 2%, so I pay back $102 to the bank. The bank, on the other hand, and over the course of 1 year, inflation is 5%. So essentially, what they could once buy with $100, they now have to pay $105 for. But they only got back $102. So they're losing out $3 of purchasing power over that 1 year. I hope you understood that. Now, don't worry about it. I know this can be quite confusing, but as I said in the previous video as well, I will be making sure that we do a lot of quizzes. I'm just accumulating my resources, and I think the next video we'll just do a bit of question solving on the past concept in this one. So stay in touch for that. Thank you everyone for watching, and stay tuned for, I don't know, unit 2.6, that is.